My name is Matthew Armstrong. This is the Be the Dad podcast. Today I have with me Bill Dotson, author and founder of Abiding Fathers. Good to have you here, Bill.
Great. Good to be with you, man.
So just to get started, what was fathering like in the time that you were a child, and what maybe are some of the differences between how things were then as what was expected as a father versus
Now.
Then
and now. I grew up right after the Depression and right before World War II. We were agricultural in nature. Small towns, at least my experience was not in a major city. So we were on the farm. Well, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandfathers, you were there working together. So you were exposed all day long on a high level of hours and minutes. You experienced, you worked, you saw things being done. You did it with your father, your grandfather, your uncles, and they were the family. It has been said it takes a village. Well, that was our village.
And so this is literally, in your case, you grew up on a farm and you guys had a farm and you worked
the first 6 years. That's who I was. My wife even until she was married to me, lived on in a rural situation.
And even the fact of having a situation where the family worked together, literally.
Yes.
Had to.
Yeah.
That's a dynamic that
you were poor, but you didn't know it. You had 3 meals. Your food was coming off the land. But the Depression and then the war of World War II, there came a mental attitude of my parents and others in that generation. They didn't want their children to have to go through what they did. So as the Industrial Revolution came, population growth came, we started moving, and still are, moving off the family farm into the cities. We moved around 6 years of age to a small town, Franklin, Tennessee, 5,000 or 6,000 people. Most everybody knew each other. My mother and dad ran a restaurant for 40 years there, and everybody knew who I was. I was an only child, and they had to work very hard. So what we have seen since then is a movement away from that. In today, mobility,
when you say
technology,
away from that, you mean moving away from the family,
the core family being together.
Some people still have elements of it, but even in families that are rather large and they get together, I didn't have that growing up, so I've always been fascinated with being around larger families, how they work. I always wanted that as a kid, and then I get around some of these large families, I'm like, dang, maybe I didn't want that, because there's so much dysfunction and everybody seems so isolated, so that when they get all together, I know this isn't true for everybody, but it seems almost like they don't really know how to connect with each other.
Well, that's come about by all the growth away from that core family. And we see it in technology, way we communicate today. I'm sure my grandchildren will hear this, but most of the time I call them, I don't get an answer, most of the time. I can text them right after that in 5 seconds or 2 or 3 minutes later, I get a text back. We've been deprogrammed from this community. And so we have to battle. We have to work harder. Then we probably got too much of each other.
Yeah, back then, it was probably too much of each other.
And now, right, I wanted my time away from that, whatever. But today, you've got to fight for your family. You've got to fight for time. And we teach, and I believe strongly, time is love. Well, I was being loved on. I didn't know that because I had so much time with my parents. And then he showed me how to ride a horse. My grandfather told me that was my horse. It really wasn't, but you couldn't convince me that Doc wasn't my horse. And he taught me how to ride bareback. He taught me all these things, how to milk a cow, and all those things that today you don't even think about. And men today go to work mostly, and they don't engage their children in their world. And so that work day, which we had then, even in the small town where I moved in the restaurant business, I was there washing dishes, cleaning up the tables, whatever I was doing. I wasn't allowed to cook the food, that's for sure. But even that town was a community. Today, like when we moved to Dallas, I was raising my children, Joanne and I were, at least from my mental standpoint, I was raising them sort of the way I'd been raised.
Yeah.
But it was in a different time, a different environment.
And different contexts where things don't work the same.
Totally different context. On our street, we didn't know people maybe 2 or 3 doors from us, and especially nobody in the community. And so you have to work at that. That's what dads have to do today. They have to take slices of time where it was just so easy before, riding the tractor, riding the horse, talking, eating 4 meals a day together at the table. And that's a lost art. The table, you learned everything. You got to talk, laugh, be corrected, whatever. Today, you know, the quote, McDonald's mentality generation, drive through, you got to battle for your family today more than you did then.
And I think for many of us, I know for me, and I want to encourage any of our listeners that battle's also this in us recognizing that since we didn't get that, I'm not going to just be able to flip a switch and be good at it. I'm going to actually have to even battle with it myself sometimes to want to get up off the couch and go outside and play, or want to deal with a situation, or instead of us drive through all the time, having enough sense that says, you know what, even if I don't feel like it, I want to make sure we have that table time together. You know what I mean? Because we've grown up with such convenience that we don't have those inbuilt disciplines that naturally were the case when you're your father. There was no other choice, right?
Yeah.
Because well, now we have a choice. I don't have to do that anymore. I don't even have to cook a meal. I don't have to, but we lose something else in the process. I loved hearing about your dad teaching you how to ride a horse and milking the cow and all that stuff.
And mainly it was my grandfather, though.
It was mainly your grandfather.
Oh, yeah. Because my dad was out working doing it. But my grandfather was really powerful in my life. Really was. I lost my first one, my dad's father, early on, but I had my other grandfather, and I had those uncles. Dad had a lot of support that dads today don't have. That's why you have to have a community. That's why dads today have got to really associate themselves with men that will hold them up, lift them up, encourage them, and you've got to seek that out.
Is there any story in particular with your own father of a situation you can recall as a kid that made an impression on you?
Oh, there's several. My dad, he never said "I love you." Those parents back then didn't. Men didn't.
Not
they
once.
didn't hug. They didn't hug. You sensed they did love you. All his buddies, hunting buddies and fishing buddies, would come around and say, "Hey, Billy, boy, your dad sure is proud of you." I'd say, I wish he'd just tell me that instead of y'all having to tell me that. So that environment's what I grew up in. That's changed a lot today. I see a real major turn of events. Men embrace each other, hug their children, their wives. They're open with their emotions, and I think that's an awesome thing. But one thing I remember about him more than any one other event, uneducated man, he smoked, he drank like most of the guys, cussed, all those things that I didn't do, that I learned to do later, whatever. But I was in the Scouts, Cub Scouts. We had a dinner, had a speaker come in, and we showed up, and we sat down at the proper time, and it was full. The room was full. And a boy and his father came in, and there were no seats left. And I remember my dad looking at me and said, "Son, let's get up and we can eat later. They need our seats.
Wow.
That was a change for me about who my dad really was down in his heart.
Wow.
Of all the men in that room,
Wow.
he was the only father that said, let's get up. Let's let them have a seat. So those
How
are
old were you around that time?
I was about 13.
Wow.
Yeah. It had a real impact on me that I really had a man that had a heart. I think the proudest moment, other than that one thing, was my dad volunteering for service and the longing I had for those 3 years that my dad would come back home. Didn't get much communication. We didn't have all the...
Okay, well, hold on. I want to back up. So you're talking about for the war? For World
during
War II?
the war. During the World War II.
World War II time.
Yeah.
How old are you at this time?
Well, I was about 7.
Okay.
6 and 7.
Wow, that's
and I
huge.
spent 3 years without him at all.
And he's gone. He
You don't hear from him. You might get a letter a year or maybe every 6 months. The only way we got news was either on a radio or we'd go to the show on on Saturday, and we'd get the newsreels, and we'd hear about the fighting in both Pacific and in Germany, and against Japan, against Germany, or whatever. And you experienced it that way, but you didn't have a parent, or you didn't have a dad.
That had to be a completely different experience than people realize, to recognize that you don't have, he's out there in this, and your connection to it is the newsreel at the theater to know kind of what might be going on that he's involved in with no contact.
Rarely did you have contact. And you constantly wondering where you're going to get somebody visit. Because we had friends that had visits from a commander that would walk up to a door and you knew what had happened. Your father or uncle or brother had died, son. And mother knew he was coming home. I think I was around 9 years of age. I went to bed that night, and the next morning I woke up and I felt this warm body in the bed. My dad had come in during the night. He had not awakened me, and he was in my bed. And that was a big moment. Wow. And so there's that vacuum of 3 years or so that I didn't have my dad. And then, and oddly enough, like a lot of men, they didn't want to talk about the war. It was too bad to talk about. So, but back then, you had to get information. This is a real difference between children then and parenting then. You had to sit at your grandfather or uncle's or father's knee and get information. What was it like when you grew up? You didn't have the devices we have today. So you had to communicate. You had to ask questions. Today, I've found children, they're not curious about your life. What was it like?
Isn't that interesting?
They become dead to that past.
It's almost like I know exactly what you're saying, and I see it in adults as well. It's been very interesting to me to see how you can spend time with people, even longer periods of time, and nobody ever asks you to inquire about your life or where you come from or what you did. And naturally, I want to know that. I feel like that's part of what, part of discovering and having a relationship, even a friendship, is I want to know about you. And it's almost like we've got so much stuff, distractions and things to do to pacify us that people aren't as curious anymore about each other.
Well, you don't have to get it from a human being. Within seconds, they can find out who hit the home run. Was it Babe Ruth or whoever 40 years ago? Today, there's not the curiosity about the past. One of the reasons that I think I was stimulated to write this book that you mentioned, From Faith to Faith, I said to myself, even if this is just for my children and my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, if no one else buys or reads the book, it's sort of my story. I want them to know something of what I believed. And then God used it in a broader sense. But my first thoughts were, this is for my children and my grandchildren and my future generation. I'm just going to write this book about fatherhood and about what some of the experiences I had and what I've learned. And I wrote it down. Whether they want to read it or not, I wrote it down.
It's interesting how we don't need to communicate with each other like we used to. That explains a lot about the last lost arts of relationships that you see dying, like the value of a meal together. Is there a moment you could say in your parenting, a story where you go, okay, I want to do something differently here?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is we'd moved to Dallas. I explained it's a little different environment, a little less communal, more spread out. I came to Dallas to make millions in the real estate development, apartment development business.
What year are we talking, by the way?
1970.
1970.
And then a couple of 3 years later, I got restless. I could sense that with all my travel, going to New York, Boston, raising funds, finding sites in various states and all that, I went at home.
You have kids at this point?
I have 2 daughters. I mean, in fact, we moved here. We had 2 daughters. And one day, I just woke up in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock. I sat up in the bed and I said, you know, they're going to be 18 one day very quickly. They were in their pre-teens. And I won't know them, and they won't know me.
Wow.
And
that's powerful.
I had a very well-paying job, the job I'd come down here with, and I went in about 2 or 3 days later, and I handed in my resignation.
Wow.
I said, and they asked me, I said, I will live out my next year contract, but I'm leaving. And it was for the sole purpose that I was missing too much. Now, Becky and Evelyn would tell you they got too much of Bill, too much of Dad. Probably did. Did it solve all of their problems? No.
You mean so after you're saying they would tell you, because before?
No, I'm just saying they probably thought, oh my gosh, we got too much of Dad after he quit traveling and all. But I was convinced something was happening, that the clock was running, and I was missing out being the dad in my family, and I was gone too much.
I got to talk to me about this because this is powerful. Tell me a little bit about that feeling and the sense that you had. And I know you said that you woke up. I mean, was it like you could just sense that you were losing connection with your children?
Absolutely. We have to understand that within that year that I made that decision, I'd had a spiritual awakening. The Lord had really spoken to my heart. I'd developed a personal relationship with Him, and my faith was deepening. And I sensed that God was just saying, Bill, just what we do today. You've been handed 2 children by me.
Yeah.
And you have a responsibility to disciple them, train them, equip them, bless them. All of the things that were running through my mind that I'm often running, trying to make a good living, buy the new car and do all that stuff. But I was losing what I was most called to be, and that was a father to these 2 girls. I didn't want to miss that. I lost a lot of money. In fact, the President Carter era, it was a horrible economic time for real estate and for banking. And I went 2 years with a 0 income. Wow. After making that decision. Trying to pick up things here and there. My parents helped us a little, got behind on mortgage payments, all of those kind of things. But it was the best decision I ever made.
Wow.
Now, again, I would say you'd have to go ask my 2 daughters, did they get too much of me? But I selfishly said, I don't want to miss this. And for dads that will look back when their children 20, 22 or whatever, and they said, man, I made a lot of money, but I missed the best years of my life. You see, children are 1 through 6, they have a need. 7 through 12, they have a different need. And 13 through 18, there's an entirely different need. And if you're not there, mentoring, modeling.
If you're not there in those different stages where they have distinct needs.
Exactly. Then they miss those experiences that are building character, building endurance, perseverance,
resilience.
Resilience. And it grew out of this post-World War II. I don't want my kids to have to go through and suffer what I did. And so it permeated this American dream,
which was actually moving the dad out of the relationship with the kids to try to make enough money so they didn't have to suffer. And in the meanwhile, the relationship suffers.
Exactly right. And it's like Brad McCoy says, don't prepare the path for the child, prepare the child for the path. Let them fail. Be there to hug them, pick them up. Let them make mistakes. But what most men that have the mentality that I'm, especially the more upscale, wealthy, or want to be wealthy dads in today's are mobile fathers that are really after it, getting after it and striving. They're trying to make their children's life easy. And what the kids want is them, not their money or this softness.
How about that?
And so when they get to college or into a marriage relationship, they don't know how to recover from a stumble. And a lot of the less wealthy, you end up having welfare children. You have welfare families because they don't know how to survive. They don't know how to work. They don't know how to be in a family relationship.
Even how to relate in relationships because they haven't had them. Man, there's so much there that I feel like there is so much gold under the surface of this conversation for us to pull from. I want to go back for just a second, though. You're telling me that the wealth that you had, the money you were making, you had a great job, a great employer, you were traveling the country, being able to afford what you wanted, luxuries and things, and even after losing it all, that was still the best decision you ever made because that choice to say, I'm not going to lose a connection with my children. And if I don't stop what I'm doing, even though I'm going to have all this money, I'm going to lose this.
We didn't have the Brady Bunch family, the perfect family. We had issues galore, but we were there for each other. I made a ton of mistakes. Joanne was a better mother than I was a father, but the absenteeism is so it's crushing to a child.
We're talking about not being present,
not
right?
being present, or if you're there, you're
still not present. You can be
present.
in the room and not present.
Absolutely.
So let's be clear about that.
For instance, last night, Joanne and I had our usual date in a Mexican restaurant. We're sitting next to a couple. They had probably a 4 or 5 year old and a 6 or 7 year old, and they were talking to each other. It was great that the husband and wife were talking, but the two children were on the other side of the table, and they never once communicated with them. And all the boys were doing was working devices, and they were getting angry at the device and shaking it and doing. There was no connection. And that's what's happened. The disconnect. And the dad's role is to ensure that it doesn't happen. He has got to plan his family. He's got to plan his family time daily. He's got to look at his schedule. He's got to involve the children. We're so drawn by the world that we lose that joy that's sitting right in our own home. And if you really, Matthew, me, any dad listening, You want to have an impact on the next generation, and we all do.
Yes, sir.
To be honest, that may be why you're working hard.
Yeah.
But the greatest impact you can have is investing and discipling your children and loving your wife.
Wow.
And letting them see that.
I mean, you mean this, and I get the sense, I know because I know you mean this very literally. This is literally the biggest way that we can impact the next generation, the world around us, the future of our planet. The single most significant way you can do that is doing something you already know you're supposed to do. And that's investing in your family, investing in time with your children and loving your children and loving your wife. I mean,
time is love. That's what it is. It isn't money. Time is love. And you got to carve it out today. You've got to work hard.
What do you mean when you say time is love?
When you're with them or not, or praying for them, or encouraging them, calling them, whatever you're doing, you're spending time, and they know you have taken time out of your day to call them and say, I love you. I'm just telling you, I'm thinking about you. What
Wow.
that does to a child, it's got to be a conscious use of your time. You can't not work. I mean, you have to earn a living. That's part of it. Mm-hmm. But you need to teach them how to work. Don't just give them everything and then one day say, oh, okay, you've got a college degree, now go to work. You know, all these things that you have spent time on is preparing them. And guess what? They also are going to impact your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. That's the investment. That's the generational investment. That's the legacy that you're leaving. And what greater legacy? You know, we don't inherit our money when we leave. There are no trailer hitches on a hearse. You can't take all of this stuff you've created with you. What you can take with you is that relationships that you've developed beginning in your own family, in your own children, in your own marriage.
How would you encourage young fathers with something that today they could actually practice? They could get off this podcast and say, this is something I can actually activate in my life today. What would you encourage them to do?
Examine whether or not, if they're married, examine whether or not they're loving their wives properly. That's the greatest witness to your children, by far. When you get home, go straight to that wife to hug her. Show the children that she's there for you for life. They come and go, your children. They need to see how important your relationship is.
Wow. I wasn't expecting that would be the first thing, is actually...
Well, it starts there because that's the greatest witness.
So, unfortunately, so before we move on that, so you heard it. I want to be really practical and just candid with you. If this isn't something you would regularly do, so what? Step out the box. So if you get home today, your partner in your relationship with your kids, your wife, your girlfriend, whoever this person is, that's there consistently in your children's lives, you need to show her the proper love and attention that she deserves.
And she's the priority.
That your kids need to see that. And that's something you can do. And just practically, first thing in the door, you give her a hug, give her a kiss, I love you.
And if she's somewhere else in that house and the kids jump all over you or whatever, you drag them right to her. And they see there is nothing greater or more devastating. See, when we elevate children to an idol, then they're lost. They don't know. They can't handle being an idol. They need to know where their place is, and it starts right behind mom or whomever is in their lives with you.
I love that though, because what I don't think a lot of us really take seriously, and maybe we need to do a follow-up podcast about just this one issue, because I don't know how many of us realize the devastation created in the children from the lack of relationship between the father and the mother. I know my single biggest issue with my parents was the way they treated each other. It drove me into a deep depression as a teenager. I remember wanting to hurt myself to try to get them to see
Certainly.
that you're hurting me when you treat each other like this.
Children will act out to get attention. But if they see a solid, loving relationship, then they're experiencing that. Then they are able to then love others, their spouse, their own children later. I have a very dear friend, and we were talking 2 years ago at a breakfast, and we were talking about these things, and he was talking about all the travel. He's in a ministry, he traveled all over the world, and he went to his 13-year-old daughter and said, honey, I just want to sit down and just tell you, I want to ask your forgiveness. I've been gone way too much. I've not been here for you as much as I should. Here's a well-meaning father. And the girl, he said, stopped him before he got through and said, Dad, you don't owe me an apology. I saw one thing. You've loved my mother, and that's all I needed to see.
Wow.
See, she saw that. She sensed that. It's going into her very fiber of her being.
That's amazing that she was able to articulate that. Tell me this 13-year-old is a quite special individual, that she would be able to articulate that sense of her own, the impact it's made on her, that
Right.
she was able to identify. That tells you how secure she felt.
Absolutely. Total security.
She had total security to
Absolutely.
where she could even stop her dad. Say,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Even
Fellas,
if you're divorced.
Yeah.
Even if you're separated.
Which I am divorced. So
Well, I mean, that's still their mother.
yeah.
And if you're holding grudges or whatever and
Yeah.
isolating yourself, you still need to overcome your own selfishness. And, she may be remarried. You may be remarried. But show honor to their mother.
That's fantastic. And that's good timing right now because Mother's Day is
Oh, yes.
just days away. I want to thank you for your time today. Thank you so much for sharing. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to us doing this again.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you for listening. This is the Be the Dad podcast. Learn more at BeTheDadMovement.com. Remember, the biggest impact you can make on the next generation is to be the dad on purpose.